Thank you for all of you, that the ones that took a trip to come today to Hamburg and also to Hamburgers. I'm Nilüfer Vadiati, Research Fellow at Digital City Science in Hafen City University. And I want to start the panel by thanking you for your time today that you brought, your interest, your care, your work, and also your attention. I believe you're standing at a pivotal moment in the development of research on digital urbanism, as digital technology from platforms, data, algorithm, computational process, and informational infrastructure are not only transforming the way cities are conceived, imagined, designed, and operated, but also transforming our understanding and experiencing of everyday life in cities to human and other than human agential bodies. These post-human and technological forms of agency, the inequality with which they are entangled, is shifting the focus of scholarship toward understanding the complex of embodiment of digital mediated lives, which for us as researchers also, I think, necessitates not just we adopt to new methods and tools, but also epistemological rethinking. The digital technology have also led to what is best described as an enthusiasm of practice, something which is exciting, something which, as for example, Casey here stated, may be unruly, or indeed something which may be just becoming possible as new technology or networks allow to diving in, or to commence practicing to see what's emerged for larger agenda or emancipatory aspiration. If we call it the practice-led research paradigm or performative research, we can say that the necessity of performative research paradigm can be derived from the linguistic or cognitive meaning-making capacity of this digital term, from purely human objects to an entangled possession with human and other human agential bodies that calls for new positioning for us as researchers. So that can be actually a good news for some of us, some of the that are becoming a little impatient with long-lasting ideas of disembodied, distance, and neutral position as researcher in the traditional qualitative paradigm. But the challenges also come with that. And going to digital urbanism and sovereignty movement in refusing to take corporate smart cities, we are facing the dual challenges that we want to conduct situated, engaged research with digitally mediated everyday life, but also we want to make sense of this complex, cloudy, and material and immaterial technological system that are heavily controlled by private companies. All that has been said, the panel today intends to look at the practices of digital sovereignty not as the object of the study, but rather as a method of research. It is particularly interested in performative research methods, repurposing the traditional qualitative methods, and careful maneuver the presenters today have taken during their empirical work/activism. Our first presentation will begin by the question of subjectivity and positionality of a researcher among technological sovereignty collectives in Berlin, which will be presented by Dr. Casey Lynch. He's the assistant professor of digitalization and society at the University of Twente, whose research path has been dedicated to criticizing dominant process of digitalization, in particular those based on surveillance, extraction, and corporate control.
So by way of a brief introduction into the tech sovereignty movement in Barcelona and my research on it, this was the topic of my PhD dissertation in geography at the University of Arizona between 2015 and 2019. Some background about the sort of situation of tech sovereignty in Barcelona. So starting around 2010, 2011, Barcelona was kind of proclaimed a premier smart city. It was one of the first cities to form partnerships with Cisco and IBM and other large companies. This was under a sort of right-of-center, very entrepreneurial municipal administration at the time. But this was also to about 2011 where the sort of smart city program began in Barcelona. It was also a period of social and political upheaval in Barcelona. So there was the sort of Occupy movement in the US, but this was the Indignados movement in Spain. So you had both in Madrid and Barcelona and other cities in Spain, a rise of social movement activity that really kind of coincided actually sort of parallel to this very neoliberal smart city vision that the municipal government was pushing at the time. In 2015, the city elected the housing activist Ada Colau, who had been really involved in stopping evictions in the city during that period in 2011 through 2015. She was elected mayor of Barcelona and really set out to change the course of the city. But also in terms of sort of setting the scene a bit in Barcelona, there's a long history of community organizing and activism in the city, including some that are perhaps directly related to digital sovereignty, as we'll discuss, like the free and open source software movement, open culture movements, and so on. But also a lot of very grounded neighborhood-based associations have long been a powerful actor in the city. Across Catalonia, there's a long history of cooperativism and kind of alternative enterprises. And so there's this sort of situation there as well. And then getting a bit closer here, we see the emergence of tech sovereignty really as it was articulated there as a discourse beginning in 2014, 2015 really, quite a bit before the municipality actually adopted that. So I think often in some of the other writing that I sometimes see about tech sovereignty in Barcelona, a lot of credit is given to the municipal administration, whereas the idea behind tech sovereignty, the sort of discourse, the way that was really taken up within the city started several years before that was addressed by the municipality and really sort of emerged out of the grassroots, right? From Calafao post-industrial, eco post-industrial district, which is a sort of interesting experimental space on the outskirts of the city, as well as, amongst multiple activists in the city. One of my favorite sort of definitions of tech sovereignty from within that sort of activist strain comes from Marga Padilla, who writes, that the question of tech sovereignty for her is the question we wish to discuss is who has the power to make decisions about technologies, about their development, about their use, about access and about distribution, about supply and consumption, about the prestige they have and their power to fascinate. It's still one of my favorite quotes to this day, is sort of setting out what this really entails, right? What the topic, at least at this period in Barcelona, is really sort of meaning to people on the ground. And so the question of my dissertation, which in retrospect I look back and I think, well, not the best formulated question, right? But what really sort of guided me on this research as I started in 2015 or so was, coming from a background more in sort of critical development studies and urban geography, focus on Central America, but really without much focus on tech or digitalization in any way. The question I set out to answer or address really was whether or not digital technologies are inherently tools of technocratic governance, surveillance, and capital accumulation, or how they might become loci for imagining and building alternative digital futures. So, and then I conducted ethnographic research in Barcelona really between 2016 and 2019. In terms of what tech sovereignty in Barcelona looks like in practice, right, we see really by 2018 really an explosion of activity between 2014 and say 2019. Some of these groups are ones that predate, so sort of helped inspire later movements, but we see a really explosion of collectives, of cooperatives, of commons-based projects, really dealing with everything from infrastructure and hardware. So we have GIFINET, as a community wireless network. It's been actually around since the early 2000s, but we see that expand to things like the Things Network, so sort of community operated Internet of Things network in the city, often doing sort of environmental sensing. Common Cloud, so hosting commons-based cloud infrastructure, and many more. A lot of sort of independent autonomous servers and so on. To cooperatives, workers' cooperatives of programmers and people developing digital tools and sort of web services, to reuse and recycling, to sort of platform cooperativism, right? So using sort of platforms, digital platforms, to organize cooperatives sort of across economic sectors, from local food through mobility to delivery services and so on, to all kinds of education and training, as well as several groups that really sprout up just to sort of reflect and theorize, sort of coordinate things around this idea of tech sovereignty. And so my research was really trying to sort of understand what was going on here. It was, there's no coordination really amongst these groups, but there's a lot of overlap, a lot of moments of people coming together and sharing knowledge, a lot of people who are sort of involved in 2 or 3 different projects. And so there really is like a kind of extensive network involved in these different groups, which I imagine have expanded, or I know have expanded quite a bit since then. And some of these have been renamed and moved on to other things, right? It's quite experimental, but this is a rough list based on around 2018. So the question of performativity of what I was sort of doing in this research, I guess, or really kind of reflecting on, I guess, multiple aspects of performativity. The first thing that I can say is that the sort of whole idea behind the project was very much informed by the notion of performativity of knowledge, as discussed by feminist economic geographers J.K. Gibson Graham, who write that this vision of performativity of knowledge, its implication and what it purports to describe, its productive power of making, has placed new responsibility on the shoulders of scholars, right? So if knowledge is performative, then those of us producing knowledge have a different responsibility that we need to be considering. That responsibility, right, is to recognize their constitutive role in the worlds that exist and their power to bring new worlds into being, not single-handedly, of course, but alongside other world makers, both in and outside the academy, right? So if we're producing knowledge, that knowledge has impacts on the world, right, or potentially, right, has impacts on the world, shapes discussions, shapes the way that people act. And so specifically in thinking about sort of alternative economic projects, post-capitalist, non-capitalist economic projects, they really highlight this idea of performativity of knowledge. And so their goal in doing research on post-capitalist economies, often in more sort of rural settings or sort of smaller settings, often really not engaging the digital in their case, but is to make them the focus of research and teaching, in order to make them more real, more credible, more viable as objects of policy and activism, more present as everyday realities that touch all of our lives and dynamically shape our futures. This is the performative ontological project of diverse economies. So this is sort of these readings, right? Gibson Graham's work were really kind of formative in my education, right? Really sort of shaped my approach to research from the beginning. And so I do sort of start from this as a base. But of course, performativity, means various things in different contexts, and of course, right, is highly, means quite a bit for how we think about subjectivity, right? Has really shaped the way that we think about subjectivity. And so beyond the sort of performativity of knowledge, I'm also interested in the sort of performativity of subjectivities, right, and what it means to be a certain kind of digital subject. So in my research into the tech sovereignty movement in Barcelona, I was interested in how space, economies, and subjectivities were being shaped sort of through these practices. And so, of course, right, subjectivity is also a question of performativity. It's this reiterative citational practice, right, through which conceptions of the self emerge in relation to normative discourses and the ways that they're enacted, right? So how do we actually, come to understand ourselves as subjects, position ourselves, understand our place in the world, and so on. And this is, I think, an open question, or has often been posed as an open question regarding some of the, in some of the other literature on digital sovereignty in Barcelona in particular. it was very nice to have this article come out right as I was submitting an article that said the open question is whether or not tech sovereignty in Barcelona is engendering new forms of subjectivity, and I thought, thank you for setting up my work for me and explaining why my research makes sense. And so I do think that was a big, an important question to ask is we can talk about digital sovereignty, we can talk about tech sovereignty. How does that actually change people's understandings of themselves, their practices, the way that they interact in the world, right, and so on. And so I reflected a bit on how mainstream digital subjectivities are shaped, right, in my paper on digital subjectivity. And I talked about how in digital capitalism, subjects are understood as programmable, right? That our data allows, through algorithmic means, we can be known as certain kinds of subjects and enrolled in different kinds of processes through our data traces and so on. That we can be predictable, and that we engage in that often, right? That we become sort of responsibilized entrepreneurial digital subjects. We both engage in sort of data practices, offering our data. Perhaps to smart city programs, but we're also considered sort of told to be entrepreneurial and responsible and perhaps learn digital tools in order to integrate in the workforce in a particular way, right, or become marketable as a worker. We're often sort of told that we have to sort of choose between being technically oriented or socially and politically oriented, right? That those are sort of separate things, and so there's a lot of discursive work really from, I think, a young age in a lot of countries at least around, what is your role? Are you an engineer? Are you a social scientist, right? Where do you fit? How do you specialize in school? These are ways that performatively, right, we are sort of shaped as subjects, as sort of technical subjects without, a clear political, explicit political orientation, or as certain kinds of social subjects, and that these distinctions are, of course, gendered and racialized and classed, right? And so technological knowledge is often discursively and then performatively understood as masculinized, right? As white, as middle class, upper class, as linked to certain kinds of subject positions, and so. All of this sort of mainstream digital subject positions are things that help uphold a certain kind of order of digital capitalism, I would say. So I was interested in how, and there's all kinds of literatures that I drew all this from, right? But I was interested in how, whether or not basically in the tech sovereignty movement in Barcelona, these things were really being actively challenged. And so I look at, I'll get quite quickly to my own sort of reflection on this, but in terms of some of the writing that I've done on this, I have looked at the practices by which different kinds of people were involved in the movement, were leading the movement, kind of how they came from technical backgrounds or social work backgrounds or political backgrounds, how they questioned some of these hierarchies of knowledge, how they questioned the way that technical knowledge and social knowledges were discursively sort of separated, and so on. And so there's just a couple of examples here of the way that you can see that a lot of the tech sovereignty movement in Barcelona, a lot of these activities are really focused around sort of care of the self, people sort of creating, engaging in different kinds of digital practices and becoming different kinds of digital subjects. So here there's a poster from an anti-Mobile World Congress, a list of events. And you can see a lot of these are about, understanding, your sort of role as a worker in the digital economy and so on, and how that can be different. This is a poster from the GIFINet network, so the Community Wireless Network, and it, explicitly says down here in Catalan, this is a space of learning where women, migrants, children, men, and obvious would be like grandparents, older people, can contribute. You can see here an install party, right, where people install open source software on their machines, right, or also often repair their machines, and they do it. They learn how to do it themselves, right? So they learn how to actually do these things, why they should be doing these things, right? What the sort of values are behind different kinds of choices that they're making, and how they can work with others, how they can learn new skills themselves, share those skills. and so on. So there's a lot of activities that are really focused on building skills, not for the sort of workforce, but for sort of cultivating a different kind of relationship to digital technologies. This is a screenshot from the Ateneos de Fabricación, which are community maker spaces in Barcelona that are actually sponsored by the municipality, one of the few that I focus on that are actually municipal programs, but that are very much focused on people coming together, people sharing knowledge on sort of social outcomes, on and learning. So aprendizaje down here means learning. And there's a lot of focus on learning and learning not for sort of professionalization, but learning for the ways that it can affect communities and so on. So there's a lot of focus actually at this level of subjectivity, I think, amongst these collectives in Barcelona. So I'll try to be quick here, but my sort of reflection on this in terms of the sort of question of the role of the researcher and sort of performative research is that I think my role in a lot of this was really as a learner myself and as a sort of becoming unruly digital subject myself, right, in a sense. I did not have, I very much was just a participant in a lot of this, and I had to learn a lot along the way myself, right? So I really did not know anything about how the internet worked before going into this, right? In terms of the hardware, the backbone, right? I really had no idea. I was quite in the dark to all of that, and then I had to learn to build and maintain my own internet infrastructure, right, with my neighbors in my neighborhood. This is a sort of kind of mental map of the local network in my specific neighborhood that I was most directly involved in sort of building and maintaining. So all these sort of blue are sort of client nodes, and then we have these super nodes that are actually relaying signals to individual houses. So we use a lot of these large antennas on the top of roofs, and then smaller antennas on individual balconies or on the roofs of buildings that then receive signals that can then supply houses or whole buildings or whole areas with internet connectivity. So I had to learn a lot about all of this. I had to learn to install these antennae and maintain them and cooperate with my neighbors to do it. There was a lot of technical skills involved, but there was also a lot of social skills involved. There was a way of knowing the city that was required, right? I had to know the laws around what rights you have to the shared roof space on your building, and how to respond to neighbors complaining that these were gonna cause cancer or something, right? There's a whole slew of knowledges that go into sort of making something like this possible. And I, as a researcher, had to be sort of involved in doing that, and there were some that I was very comfortable with and some that I was not, and the technical aspects for me were quite intimidating. So I had to learn from my neighbors and teach myself and come to see sort of internet connectivity in a very different light. The whole point of this is to say that I think through the research, a lot of the sort of performativity that was going on was that I was actually sort of learning to perform or sort of embody these different kinds of subject position myself in relationship to digital technology, right? I sort of had the theoretical knowledge of technology and society are not separate and everything is complicated, and I had read all the philosophy and I had really believed all of this, but then for my own sort of subject position, right, I was very uncomfortable in sort of technical spaces with technical knowledge. I felt very much more comfortable in the sort of philosophy, social theory kind of world. And so I really had to force myself to engage in different kinds of knowledge, understand different kinds of knowledge, where people were coming from with their own kinds of knowledge, and try to understand this in a different way. And so I think from a researcher perspective, I was very much a sort of a learner, sort of becoming an unruly digital subject alongside these people who were becoming unruly sort of digital subjects. And so I think, and people would often tell me things like, well, you know, I'm involved in this project, but I don't understand the technical side, or I didn't understand, I got lost in this last meeting where these three people really went on about why we need to upgrade the antenna to this new antenna because it's going to allow us to do all these different things. I didn't understand any of that, but then like I did understand these parts, and I would be like, yeah, no, I'm right there with you, right? Like there were parts that made me quite uncomfortable. And where I felt quite outside of my element. But I think that was a very important learning experience for myself. So I'll wrap up soon, but to say that this has, I think, really shaped my trajectory since then. My research has become, I think, more active, perhaps more design-oriented, which is interesting to see. There's a whole sort of discussion about design, experimental design disciplines over here on the board. But I think my own research has become much more focused on trying to bridge and understand different kinds of knowledge, challenge different forms of knowledge. And so the project I had going in Nevada for the University of Nevada for the past 3 years, it's ongoing, although I'm sort of now further away from it, is working with a roboticist and the curators of 2 museums who during COVID really wanted a robot tour guide in the museum, which I felt very uncomfortable about, but they really wanted a robot tour guide. And so we actually formed a sort of interesting interdisciplinary team to develop the robot ourselves, right? Understand what these specific museums wanted from a robot, right? What specific issues they wanted it to solve, right? What specific aesthetic choices they wanted for their museums, right? What kinds of control they wanted over how the robot would operate, and worked with a quite fairly critical, I would say, roboticist who's opposed to commercializing his robots, which was an important starting point for us, but it allowed us to create, I think, quite a creative team of artists, roboticists, museum curators, and social scientists to do a kind of experimental design project. This seems like very different from the sort of ethnographic work on tech sovereignty in Barcelona, but I think has very much informed my sort of approach to this in the way that I go about it, right? The way that I approach different kinds of knowledge, and the sort of experimental way of trying to put them together and thinking, and I think more creative ways about digital social futures or whatever. And then as a sort of last point is that I now teach at a technical university, and I teach engineers. I teach engineers and philosophers, actually, is the sort of interesting point, I think. So I teach in a Master's of Philosophy of Science, Technology, and Society program, where I think sometimes I encounter some philosophizing without necessarily an attempt at understanding the kinds of technical knowledge that they're actually philosophizing about. And then I also obviously encounter a number of engineers who don't necessarily see how they're just engineering, they're just solving a problem. They don't necessarily want to think deeper. And so I haven't been in this job long, but I'd say it's very much one of my ongoing challenges is to think about how the sort of unruly digital subjectivities might inform my teaching in engineering school. Trying to create new kinds of collaborations, force people to think outside the box or think outside of their comfort zone, and so on. So that's my sort of goal now, I would say. So that's all, and yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, and sorry for the
no, that's fine.
It was working, then I didn't.
Damn technical tools, yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for the insightful first, starting off presentation of our workshop. I'm Lena Unger, the discussant of this presentation. I came from Dortmund this morning. Introducing myself briefly, I'm a spatial planner by training and doing my PhD there also on the topic of digital sovereignty. And thank you also for inviting me to the workshop. For me, the concept of performativity. I've not been trained in performative research and research methodology, so I was reflecting a lot on my way of becoming a researcher and what this might mean. And yes, you already touched upon some of these aspects regarding your work, but what would be interesting for me, from my perspective, is backtracking it a little further from this point in your work. Where did you first get in touch with this research philosophy or research paradigm, and then what were the moments and movements that you came across while doing research, being a student, and from then on, how did it influence your way and how you do research?
Yeah, so how did I sort of come to this point? So before doing this research, I had lived for several years and researched for a few years in Honduras mostly, and I was really involved in, I think, much more directly activist research, right? Issues around sort of land rights and so on in Honduras, specifically land rights around a sort of libertarian Silicon Valley inspired imaginary of a new city and autonomous jurisdiction in Honduras. Basically, Peter Thiel was trying to colonize a little section of Honduras, and so that's sort of where I came into contact with sort of activism against Silicon Valley, right? I guess was very much more sort of directly activist research, where my position as a researcher was quite different in that there were different kinds of power imbalances between me as a sort of privileged, white North American male with mobility, right? I was able to, working with communities facing displacement, right, in Honduras. But my role in that research was often much more directly activist, in that I would get information that I would share with organizers, right? We would sort of write things together, we would strategize together, right? I spent a lot of time in human rights observers camps and so on, and so there was this much more, I was sort of very comfortable with activist sort of research, I would say. And I think actually when I started this research, I felt like I wanted to be sort of more active. And so I had a lot of ideas of how I could sort of contribute more to what was going on in the sort of tech sovereignty sphere in Barcelona. But really the sort of community, the sort of networks in Barcelona were just so far beyond anything that I sort of imagined that, the example that I always give is when I first went and started kind of talking to people, I thought, well, what can I really bring? Well, I'm a geographer, I have some basic GIS experience, like I could, there's a lot of sort of alternative economy things going on in Barcelona, solidarity economy, like I could make like some kind of interactive, community-based, participatory GIS map of solidarity economy things going on in Barcelona. And like 6 months later, it was like done. People had just done it themselves. They were like, someone was like, that's a great idea, and then they just did it, right? And so there are all these, and it would have taken me way longer because I don't have that good of GIS skills, and people just sort of taught themselves and figured out how to do it and brought in, this person knows. And so any idea that I had of like, okay, I'm going to really kind of take a more active role and sort of lead a sort of participatory GIS project or something, right? All of that sort of went out the window when I realized that I just like really had a lot to learn from these people, and that they were sort of light years ahead of me in terms of their thinking and their the activities that they were sort of planning. And so I think I really did, as I said, sort of came to realize that my role in that particular scenario was to be more of a learner and just sort of learn from, I thought, there's something very interesting going on here. I think a lot of the people I worked with often didn't recognize that what they were doing was so interesting and sort of assumed that this was very common everywhere. And I'd have to say like, no, like, please share your thoughts on this because it's very, very interesting. And so I think my role became sort of, sort of student. Whereas I went into it, I think, with this idea that I would be more active and play this more active role, which I had done previously in research. So I think my reflection on that is that it's important to sort of reflect on every research scenario is different, and especially if you're doing any kind of community-based work or ethnographic work, how you fit in those spaces and how you relate to those different communities and those people is very fluid and can shift quite a bit and depends a lot on the scenarios. And so, I think I had to sort of reevaluate it several times what I was doing and how I could, and it was very much that I didn't have a whole lot of special things to offer, but I could definitely hang out in meetings and put an antenna on my roof and help, run some cables up to the up to the roof and connect somebody's house to the internet, and I could learn to do those things. But there was a learning process, and for me, that learning process, I think, was the research. I don't know if that answers the question, but
it does.
Okay.
It does. Yeah. Thank you for the interesting excursus outside of this frame of the presentation, but. I would also, I appreciate the privilege to ask the first question, but I think, we don't have that much time left, so in the remaining 5 minutes, I would like to open the floor for maybe 1 or 2 more questions if we have time.
I can start, because I think this one aspect that you were talking about with not being from the tech world yourself, and like, I think this is something that would be very nice to reflect on together, because I think it happens to all of us that we are engaging with things that we can understand, and then all of a sudden we hit this wall of the black box where we're just like, I didn't understand, and to like constantly hit against that wall and try to like shape what it is you're not understanding, and how much do we need to understand it, because that I can feel is from my own point of view of just, am I just scraping like the surface constantly, because there is so much more, especially when we talk about tech politics, like what is the politics behind it. If we would understand even further into the infrastructure and the coding and the architecture of these systems, what else could we see, and how can we start like unpicking or trying to like scratch open this black box, and at least how can we start describing it very clearly, to at least show where we're not capable, what we're not capable of talking about.
I think this idea that I very much relate to that idea of like hitting the, like, oh wait, I thought I understood how this works, and then I'm totally lost, right? And so, I mean, I think it's there's a few good papers. I'm trying to think of the now, but I think about quite a bit where it's sort of trying to recognize that opacity is sort of key to the way that some of these things work, right? And so sometimes it's not necessarily, I think there's a temptation to always open the black box, or to try to open the black box or scrape at it. And I think there are moments where there's moments where that's helpful, and there's moments where it can be a dead end. And I think it takes some practice to sort of know digital sovereignty.
May I add something? My feeling is that it does not always help to open the black box.
Yeah, I agree.
My experience with interviewing is that those experts that I'm interviewing appreciate that I'm an outsider, because that I don't understand their core business, because I do see things they don't see. And that this is an opportunity for them also to reflect upon things they, in their inside viewed.
I think I agree, and then I think this is why it was a bit of a shock doing this research, because it was suddenly people were saying, no, like I'm not the tech person, and this isn't the business person, and this isn't the, it's like, no, we all do this together, and we're all going to discuss all of this, and we're going to manage this together, and it's really hard to sort of parse out what's the sort of tech side, and what's the political question, and what's the sort of economic question, and all of this. And so conversations would sometimes move quite freely between like discussions of neighborhood politics, and then like what kind of antenna we needed, and then or how to relate to the maker space, and how to move. Especially, I was doing this research during the Catalan independence referendum, and a lot of the politics around that, and so there'd be like a big discussion about a debate about independence and how to manage whatever, and then people discussing how they're going to connect polling places to the internet and like help create the sort of secure digital voter rolls for the illegal, independence referendum. And so there was just like the constant sort of mixing of themes, right? That I think was quite different from whenever I've interviewed people in sort of industry who are like, well, I'm the engineer and my role is this. I'm the marketing person, my role is this. Those bounds were so much more blurred that it led me to have to open or try to open the black box in different moments, in different ways. Yeah.
We have time if anybody has a question.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing your inspiring research and also your experiences becoming a digital subject. I was wondering whether you also reflect, or whether you also became a digital sovereign subject. Or maybe to put it differently, I understood your presentation also as a plea for understanding tech sovereignty as knowledge practice. And where is the affordances of the digital technologies themselves, and do you think you cope with that too?
I think it's a constant, there's constant tensions and conflicts, and this is something, that I would see. I was very impressed by how advanced and how, extensive some of the networks were in Barcelona, but they would always run into these the limitations, right? The sort of choices that have to be made of like, the sort of limitations of their sovereignty, right? Or their limitations of the affordances of the digital. I think one of the things that I think was quite interesting about this was it was a lot of these groups were obviously would engage this discourse of tech sovereignty in their case. But a lot of people would say like, there's plenty of things, like plenty of times that we come up with questions and then actually there's no tech involved, no real technical anything involved in what we're doing. We realize, we have this, somebody came to us with this problem in the neighborhood, and actually there's this cooperative down the road that's doing something really interesting, so we're going to work with them, and then there's actually no tech going on. So there was like a number of times in which like the affordances of, I think sometimes the sort of risk of this is that we end up centering the digital, right, and centering the technology as a sort of solution. Maybe as a different kind of solution, or solution to different kinds of problems, or sort of involved in solutions in different ways. But I think the question of sort of the affordances of, there's a number of times where we would realize like, actually, we can't do what we want, or people would realize we can't do what we want to do, or we don't need I think my classic one is like, we don't need a blockchain for this, right? Was my favorite thing. Was sometimes, especially in 2016, it was a slightly different time. People would sometimes say, maybe blockchain would be an interesting solution for this. We could really, use blockchain for this. Even in these sort of critical circles, like, maybe it's blockchain. And I think often the solution was actually, no, we don't need a blockchain for this. I think we need to like go talk to the guy down the street, And so I think that's an interesting aspect of this, is like that the role of technology or the digital in whatever kinds of sovereignties were being pursued in Barcelona at this time. So tech sovereignty was one, but around this time there was a lot of discussion on energy sovereignty, health sovereignty, educational sovereignty. Like sovereignties was sort of, there's a book in Catalan called Sovereignties that came out around this time, and it from the sort of anti-capitalist, pro-independence political platform in Catalonia. So sovereignties were sort of all the rage, and all different kinds of sovereignties, and tech sovereignty intersected with these other kinds of sovereignties in a variety of ways. But I think there's always a bit of tension, but often it was clear that tech wasn't always the solution, right? I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. I really enjoyed that, and just thinking through your example. I really appreciate that. And I thought it was so interesting to think through the notion of being uncomfortable. And I just have to say, you're not alone. I've been feeling uncomfortable for 5 years now, since I kind of started anything with tech as an urban scholar. And I think it's actually a crucial thing to think about how we position ourselves within the fields as well, right? I mean, being uncomfortable has to do with hierarchies that you pointed out, with knowledge structures, with contact and interaction and connection and all that. So I was wondering, because I have that feeling as well, also towards communities that I work with, did you bring back the work that you did, the academic work that you did, to this community? Was it like a fluid interconnectedness of the various fields that you interacted with? Or did you feel like it kind of, I don't know, faded out in academia or more in activism? What's the slash between that Nilüfer pointed to at the beginning?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so I definitely did, bring back my thoughts on this to different people or different groups within these networks, but there's no like, I think I probably would have, had it not been for COVID and moving and a bunch of other things, gone to one of the like tech sovereignty conferences, as sort of community-oriented conferences, and sort of presented. That was always a plan, because I was very involved in that group during my research. But there's no like one place to kind of bring it to everybody. So there's a lot of like side conversations, a lot of like, this is what I'm thinking, a lot of, I'm going to write something like along these lines, and having a lot more informal conversations with people. I sort of wish I had an opportunity to do more of like maybe somewhat more formal presentation of things that I did in some space where a variety of groups were maybe together, but I didn't end up with too many opportunities with that, partly through timing. So in terms of how it's sort of, I think partly it's sputtered out in academia, but then also I've got involved in a number of more sort of design-oriented projects, and sometimes I'm able to sort of draw new connections between a sort of digital critical social work group in Barcelona, with like, some people who are having vaguely similar ideas in the US, with people who are having vaguely similar ideas in other places where I have networks. And so I've been able to do a lot of sort of network building sort of between groups, which has been great. So I think there's quite a bit in terms of like the outcomes of the work are sort of hard to sort of, I've never really done quite an inventory of it. I think I would have felt comfortable. I felt totally comfortable going back to the groups that I worked in and sort of presenting my ideas or my take on what they were doing, and hearing their impact, their input, because partly because they weren't so tech focused, right? And so in a lot of these cases, right, you have groups that were started by people who really had no tech background themselves, and were like, I was an unemployed social worker during the economic crisis, and realized that like, we were getting screwed by big cable and our internet provider, who was like not providing any good service and charging us way too much. And so I started a, consumer cooperative, for internet, right? Sort of alongside the GeeFiNet example. And, I had to go into these meetings with people from, internet service providers, and I would be sitting there on my computer, like Googling terms, trying to figure out what they were doing, right? So a lot of the groups, a lot of people in these communities express similar kinds of concerns. And so I think that allowed me to both recognize those things that I was facing myself, and then also communicate a bit more freely with them. But I'd say that's a bit what happened with me.